So we've looked at the attributes of God, some which are particular only to him, and some which he shares with us, even though we reflect them imperfectly. I want to look at how those characteristics combine and address, well, I'm going to say a basic problem, a basic question that's been bouncing around for centuries and centuries. If God is a loving God, why does evil happen? So we just finished a rollicking conversation about who God is, and you found out a few things about who Phil is. I'll give a pause so you can edit that if you want to.
No, it's okay. Let's go on.
Okay, but I want to continue looking at some issues in light of the characteristics we talk about. In particular, if God exists, why do the experiences we see in life seem to contradict some of the characteristics that I talked about? For instance, God seems incapable of or indifferent to stopping evil. We see evil happen all the time, yet he is sovereign. God seems to permit evil, yet he is holy. God seems unwilling to judge evil. Evil people prosper quite a bit and get away with a lot of things, yet he is just. And finally, God seems indifferent to people's sufferings, but God is love. Do you let people that you love suffer if you can stop it? This, again, has been a challenge through centuries. And there are a few aspects of this. There are a few ways to answer this or understand it. A few things we have to come to grips with. Well, first and foremost is we are using our own personal standards to determine what is evil. Now, some things are truly evil. Yeah. Satan is evil, and those who follow Satan or those who reflect Satan's qualities, they're evil. Although we're going to see that in and of itself does not contradict God. We'll get there in a minute, but right now I want to look at the simple fact that a lot of times we are using our own definitions, our own understanding of things, and not looking into God's perspective or God's standards of some things. For instance, moral evil. Now, people can treat other people horribly. There's no doubt about that a great deal of true evil does happen in this world. And one thing we have to understand is that God gives people choices. The problem of evil is really understanding a balance between God's sovereignty and free will, because God has given us the ability to make our own choices, even if they're really bad choices. So we have to understand that, there are choices that are made out there, really bad choices, and God gives us that right, but he also ties in consequences and responsibilities. Phil, if you could read Deuteronomy 30, 11 through 15.
Okay. This is labeled the offer of life or death. Now, what I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It is not up in heaven, so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us as we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea, so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so you may obey it. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess.
Okay. One example of God talking to the Hebrew people at the end of their 40 years in the wilderness. And he's saying, okay, guys, you've got a choice. And I'm going to tell you the choice ahead of time. If you follow my commands, you will have life and prosperity, which seems like a no-brainer of a choice. If you don't follow my commands, if you disobey me, there will be destruction and curses. So choose life. Good advice. The people did not follow God's advice. The people did go off and disobey God, and there were curses and consequences. So, God tells us what the deal is, and we make choices accordingly. And if we make a bad choice, okay, but there are consequences behind it. Now, pretty much every culture has some code, some concept of right and wrong. The details for these things might differ from culture to culture to some extent, but still cultures have codes of conducts, things that are acceptable, things that are not. We call them laws. And if you follow the laws, everything's okie dokie, everything's great. If you break the law, well, granted, if you break the law and you're caught, there are consequences. With God, he is all-knowing, so you can't break a law and not be found out. God knows when you break laws. So, if you're speeding down the highway at 80 miles an hour and you go through a radar setting, you can pretty much expect a ticket. That's just the way it is. And you can complain about it all you want to, but it's not a surprise. You know how fast you were going. You can't argue with the officer. He's just doing his job. So people know codes of right and wrong. And so people usually know when they're breaking that code. I've never heard of a burglar walking into a house saying, hey, everybody, how you doing? I just want to take your appliances and silver, and I'll see you later. Bye. They do it at night or when nobody's home because they know if they get caught, they're going to be in big trouble. They may choose to do it, but they know they're doing the wrong thing. So, yes, God knows about this. He has given a choice, but still, you can't blame God for this particular expression of evil. He's told people what to do. And he's told people that if you break his commandments, there will be consequences, either imposed by people or imposed by God. And I would argue that the consequences of not following proper laws go beyond just legal consequences. If you're going to be a thief, well, you're going to lose trust. You're going to be limiting your social circles tremendously, and you're always going to be in fear of being caught. That's not a life of great substance, in my opinion. That's not a life of great quality. So there's a trade-off. There are consequences. Some people might not mind those consequences. I wouldn't live with them personally. If you're breaking the law, or if you're breaking God's law, you've been given that choice. You've been given that right. But keep in mind there will be consequences in this world and in the world to come. More about that another time. Another aspect of evil in the world is natural disaster. When an earthquake hits, or there's a hurricane or a tornado or some sort of major natural disaster, a tsunami, people always say, oh, why does God allow that sort of thing? Why does God allow innocent people to suffer? And it's a good question, but at the same time, you can't call natural disaster evil. Natural disasters happen randomly. They don't target anyone. No one is immune from them. So, and they're not malicious in and of themselves. They happen. An earthquake in some deserted area of the world can be just as powerful as one in the middle of a city. They're the same activity, it's just the location is different. And it just happened to be where the earthquake occurred. So natural disasters are morally neutral. Now, where we put ourselves in these, there can be an aspect of responsibility. I remember part of the conversation around Hurricane Katrina, when it hit New Orleans, was first, maintain the levee system. We told you it was given out, and that was ignored. At least it was ignored in the lower sector. And second, they were told, you've built a major city below sea level in a bowl, and if a hurricane comes, it's going to be horrible. But no one did anything about it. So people knew the dangers.
Right.
It was not a surprise, just nobody did anything about it. And so you have to ask the question, is the hurricane the problem, or is the lack of activity the problem? Yes, it would have cost millions and billions probably to fix the problem. But how much did it cost to rebuild New Orleans? You got to kind of weigh off on these things. So there's, again, human responsibility in this. You've got to take some responsibility for where you build things, and got to be responsible for the information you receive about it at some point. And you can't just do the wrong thing and hope for the best. Now, you've got to understand things happen. And, as far as illness goes and injuries, a lot of that happens, and that's another part of a sort of a natural disaster. It's a natural consequence of being human. We live in a fallen world. We have imperfect bodies. Things wear out, things break. There are germs and viruses, and sometimes they affect us. We know we live in a fallen world. We know that we are mortal. When it becomes apparent, people act surprised. Grandma is 86 and she's had cancer for 8 years, but I never expected this to come. I sympathize with your grief. I understand that's difficult, but you need to understand that at some point, we're all going to pass away. Nobody gets out of this world alive. And so whatever we suffer in this world is not going to be permanent. But if we develop an eternal outlook, if we have an understanding that life in these particular bodies will wear out here, but there is a life beyond, and God has invited us to be a part of that, that changes things tremendously. At least it does from my perspective. That when I can talk about someone who has passed and I know they have a faith commitment, it's more of a celebration. Not that they're gone, but that they've gone to a much better place for real. And that can also be very comforting for people. So, yeah, it's difficult, it's unpleasant, but just because something is unpleasant, just because something is painful, does not in and of itself make it evil. And just because it's something bad, you can't blame it on God. Now, the next part of hardships and evil is that hardships are necessary for people to grow in faith. It builds our character. It makes us stronger, better, faithful people. And Phil, if you could start with James 1 through 5.
James, that's the New Testament.
Yeah.
Chapter 1, verse 1 through 5? No,
yes.
Verses 2. 1. Okay. James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. Greetings. And this part is labeled trials and temptations. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. But when he asks, he must believe and not doubt, because he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind.
Good, thank you. And now if you could continue in 12 to 16.
Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when, by his own evil desire, he is dragged away and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death.
So what James is saying there basically is there are going to be temptations and trials. And I do want to point out that the word through the New Testament, which, the words, I should say, a test, a trial, a temptation, are all the same word. They're translated differently depending on the area or depending on the context, but they're all the same root words, so they all have the same essential meaning. And it means something which threatens to come between you and God. It's either something that is difficult and it might push you away from God, or it's something very appealing that would draw you away from God. But either way, it's something that affects your relationship with God. And James is saying here basically that, when this happens, count it all joy because you are being strengthened spiritually. You know, you're basically doing a spiritual workout. It's like going to the faith gym and getting stronger in the process. Now, perseverance is a really important part of our faith. Sometimes people think of faith as a flu shot. It's like, you go to the doctor, get the flu shot, you're good to go. Faith commitment doesn't work that way. You have to hang in there with your faith, and it's got to make a difference in your life. It's not just about saying words at a certain time, but it's about meaning them and making a commitment that carries through. It goes on to say, too, that God is not the source of temptation. Actually, we are our own source of temptation, that we're still fallen creatures. And we have these old urges and old ideas, and they rear their ugly head from time to time. And we have decisions to make then. It uses the verb, too, that when that happens, that sometimes we are dragged away. It doesn't say who does the dragging. I do believe that dark forces, dark spiritual forces are involved with that. We can't pin everything on the devil, but we can't take all responsibility ourselves. But either way, we don't have to let it happen necessarily. We probably will, just because we are human, we get caught off guard, but we don't have to do that. That's by repetition, that's how we strengthen our faith, and that's how we develop perseverance. So these things, they don't come from God necessarily, but God puts them to a good, positive use. This is where I said before that the evil that happens in this world, the trials, the temptations and so forth, the difficulties we go through, God can use those. God has a purpose for those. He doesn't create them, but he can still use them, and he uses them to develop our faith. Now, there is one last aspect to evil, and looking at these aspects, actually you have to say to a degree, well, if it's something that benefits us, can we really call it evil? Well, yes, we have to recognize it as something that is not of God, but God has purposed it for something positive. And there's another aspect of the positive nature, that the use of sin, if you will, the use of obvious weaknesses. And Phil, if you can read 1 Corinthians 11, 18 and 19.
11, 17, 18. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and to some extent I believe it. No doubt there have been there have to be differences among you to show which of you have God's approval.
Now, this is sort of an interesting verse. We don't hear about this a lot, but it makes a profound statement. What it's saying is that there have to be differences. There have to be distinctions. There have to be people out there that are not following God, not doing God's will, because how else will we tell the difference? How else will we know who to follow and listen to and who not to? In other places, in the Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about you shall know them by their fruits, which means false prophets. Just kind of take a look at what they're doing, take a look at what they're saying, and you'll know if they're authentic or not. So the activities, if you understand God's will and God's character, and you can see who's breaking it, who's not following it. In this particular case, the problem is that the people in Corinth, when they were supposedly celebrating the Lord's Supper, they were actually creating and emphasized differences. Happened to be socioeconomic differences. They were really following a social pattern of entertaining. That for the first round of a meal, you would invite your close friends and you'd have a feast with them. And then later on, an hour or two later, you would have a more general invitation and people would come and graze. It would be more of a social time with some light hors d'oeuvres. It wouldn't be a full meal. And that was highlighting who was socially affluent, who was economically affluent, and who wasn't. So the practice of the Lord's Supper at Corinth was actually highlighting differences and making for cliques and divisions. And God does not like cliques and divisions. God is very much opposed to that kind of separation of his people. So what Paul is saying here is basically, okay, you see the people that are making the divisions. You see the people that are causing the problems, and you know they're not following God. So I'm not saying you should be mean to them. I'm not saying you should shun them, but I am saying that you need to follow people who are more faithful and follow them and listen to them, instead of trying to win the favor of those who are more affluent. We like to win the favor of rich people, even now, but doesn't mean they're necessarily more faithful. God wants us to follow the faithful, and bad practices, evil practices, help us to make that decision, help us to distinguish who to follow and who not.
Yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily rich people. I mean, I would say popular people, or people that we aspire to be or try to become more like. That's who we would favor towards, you know.
True. Well, true. We do have our idols.
Yeah.
And yet we gravitate toward them. But if someone is popular in society, there's a really good chance they have a lot of money.
Okay.
I can't think of anyone off the top of my head who was very, very popular internationally,
Right.
and had no money. Maybe Gandhi.
Yeah.
That's one name that comes to mind. He could have been rich, but he shunned that, and good for him.
Yep.
But, popular people tend to have a lot of money. And I'm not saying that having money is bad. The verse in the Bible often misquoted, it's the love of money, which is the root of all evil.
Right.
So you may or may not have money, but if you have a love of money, that's going to be a problem. It's going to skew your decisions.
Right.
And so, yeah, still we do try to find the favor of people who are popular and influential who happen to have a lot of money. Actually, I heard a story about someone who was significantly wealthy having a conversation with someone else, and this other person said, I don't envy you because you don't know who your friends are. You don't know who's a friend with you because they like you, or who's a friend with you because they want your money. And that's a distinct problem, I think, among rich people. Because, hang around me, you might get some loose change. I don't have great assets.
Right.
So, Yeah, we still like to be buddy-buddy with rich people if possible. But be that as it may, again, I'm not busting on rich people. I'm more busting on the gold diggers. And we have gold diggers in our society. Don't be a gold digger. Find somebody who truly reflects the character of Christ, or who reflects the moral code of God, and consider them authentic. Follow them. So these are some ways to think about the problem of evil. In the next installment, I'm going to take some time to look at the issue of predestination. What does it mean? What does it imply? How do we deal with it? How do we deal with it? But for now, thank you for your time. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them, or again, to put them in my email. Thank you very much.
Thank you.